Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. Thank you for your Sabbath day and the ability we have to all come together, to worship together. Lord, it's already October. It has been a challenging year in so many ways and not yet over. I pray, Lord, that you will have mercy upon your people, that you will stabilize us in this difficult time period, that you will shine your light upon us, you will feed us. And every soul that is struggling, Lord, that they will find themselves anchored in the message, anchored in the increasing knowledge of your character that you are giving to your people. I pray, Lord, that this will comfort them and unify us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, beginning with some review, as we tend to, we still have up all the board work from last week. What this presentation and the last Sabbath was intended to be was more of a revision. We have, over the last months, been working our way up to Millerite history with very little revision. Something people are not blaming me for, but there is, without the blame, there are complaints about that. People are struggling with that. So what I wanted to do was, in these two presentations that I have without a period of break, to cover some of the questions that people have been asking. And many of these questions, as I've tried to communicate last week, are good, honest questions that need answering and clarification. So we addressed the first one of those questions, and that relates to the election, the current election, and a study that was presented really 2018 and 2019 about the last president. Not that last president study, but the parable that was drawn from that about the external and internal change of leadership in 2014. So the question asked by quite a number of people is, if Trump is not re-elected this year, what does that do to the study of the change of leadership in 2014? So before going directly into that question, what I wanted to do instead was to have a look at how our reform lines are structured and how they operate. So we began a discussion of our reform lines, particularly when it comes to what we call the fractals, those smaller portions. So I want to review that and just have another look at fractals in a little bit more detail, covering the same material but with a bit more information. We discussed last week that there are three types of fractals. We have exact self-similar fractals, quasi-self-similar fractals, and there's a third type of fractal that we're not going to discuss that relates more to statistics and complicated numbers. So I really just want to discuss those first two types. We'll make some room. So we have exact self-similar and quasi-self-similar. So some people may be a little bit more familiar with the study of fractals. But for me it was very interesting to actually look at, because some of the details of it were a refresher or new to me. So just to break down those titles, what does it mean to be similar? And I want to remind everyone that this is being treated, just like last week, as a Q&A session. So I'm hoping for a very interactive chat room. I'm trying to imagine everyone's faces are here. It's much easier to present if you're in a community than looking at your own face. So I'm imagining you all in front of me, and I hope that it can be on the chat interactive. Equal, the same. Does anyone else want to give a definition of similar? Sister Lynn, qualities that are the same. Like one another.
Yes, but not exactly the same.
So
Similar?
Similar
is just not exactly, I don't think, anyway.
I think you're correct, and Brother Raymond is correct. I think everyone is correct if you combine everyone's answers. If you were to look up the Webster's dictionary, similar is like, it's resembling. Similar may signify exactly alike. So if you had two things, you could say that they're exactly alike. They're similar. When we say similar, we are meaning exact. But it can also signify a likeness in the principal points. We generally understand similar to denote a likeness that is not perfect. So this is what Sister Marilyn was saying. In our minds, we generally associate similar with being not a perfect comparison, but it can mean exactly alike. So you could say that these two pens are similar. They have qualities that are attributes associated with both. As the dictionary said, they have a likeness in the principal points, but they are not exact. You could say that these two are similar, and we would be meaning that they are exact. So it means either way, either just alike in principal points or alike in the entirety. So similar can mean either things. What is, in this context, what is it similar to? Because here we have two pens. What is the similarity? What are we saying when we mean similar?
From the exact point of view, the shape, the colour.
So if I was to lift up this pen, I'm going to say it's similar. What do I mean? What do you have to have? Brother Brendan says size and colour, or size only in this context. Sister Lynn, shape, size, colour, function. I think it's my question that was at fault. You're all correct. What I was trying to indicate is you have two things. So when you say this is similar, Brother Raymond gets it. He says you're only holding up one. Brother Russell, you must have two things. Sister Josephine, characteristics. Brother Ray, we need two. That is the point I wanted to present. You need two. So if you're going to say this is similar, what are you lacking? What you're comparing it to. So you can say this is similar to this. Or with our black pens, this in its own, if you say it's similar, you must have to have something that you're making a comparison to. So if we could answer in our chat, if we don't mind. When we're talking about fractals, just going by the definitions, what is the similarity? What are the things that are similar? Brother Wally, a pattern? Brendan, the structure? Sister Lynn, waymarks. We're not bringing it to our lines yet. We're just sticking with the titles, the names of these two types. Brother Ray, the principles, appearances. The word that the answer is in the title. What is similar? Self. Sister Lynn gets it. What is similar is parts of the self. Does that make sense? So you have self, similar. So when we look at the word similar, it can mean exact, that two things look exactly alike, or that they are alike in principal parts. Leaving that open definition to one side, what is similar is self. So you must then, with that self, what do you have to have with that self? Because if I had a hand and I said it's self-similar, it's similar to itself, then what are the two things? You have to start breaking down that one thing. Does that make sense? Because self denotes one. So if you're going to have self-similar, you have to start breaking down the self into different parts that have similar components. So you can look at our tree up here, and you could say it's one structure, it's one self. Is everyone with me? So this is one structure, it's one self. If you're going to say that it's self-similar, then with similar you must have more than one thing to be comparing. So what you're doing is you're breaking that one thing into parts and comparing those parts to each other. Brother Brendan, you're comparing it to itself. Yes. So you must then, with that itself, be breaking it down into different parts. So it is self-similar. The different parts of that one self are similar to one another. And then this word tells us what type of similar. Because similar is not specific. As we said before, it can be, these two pens can be exactly alike, or they can be alike in principal parts. So it needs to be more specific. Is this division of the parts exactly similar or quasi-similar? And quasi just means, it just means that other version of similar that Sister Marilyn shared with us about it being almost, or in principal components, they are the same. Quasi, I'll give the Merriam-Webster definition for quasi. Having some resemblance, usually by possession of certain attributes. So those two words, exact or quasi, are really just telling us which type of similar that we're dealing with. It's the exact version of similar, or it's the partial version of similar. where there's principal components that are the same. At this point, thankfully for me, seems kind of simple. I'd encourage or challenge anyone to try and start Googling fractals for an easy definition. It's actually quite a complex branch of mathematics, and a very recent one at that. So I'm not going to pretend to have an in-depth understanding of that field of geometry and mathematics, but it's really quite complex. Can give you quite a headache. But I want us to just become a little familiar with the concept of what fractals are. We should also be aware that it is a complex branch of geometry mathematics. So what I'd like to do is show how fractals are usually observed, because they're something that comes up in nature all around us. So I'm going to share screen, and I just want to give a little bit of a explanation of how they're seen in nature, because it's all through nature that you find fractals. So one of the most common that gets spoken about is a fern. Can everyone see the fern? Can everyone see the fractal? So if you were to take that as one self, it's one entity, it's one leaf, you would call it a self-similar fractal. Because if you started breaking that down into parts, it's going to have a self-similarity about it. If you were to cut that halfway through that branch, that end part is just going to look like a smaller version of the whole. If you were to tear off one of those small branches, it just looks like a smaller version of the whole. Can everyone see that? I can't see the chat, so I'm going to assume yes. That is an example of fractals in nature, and that is where they are principally observed. So I'll share another one. This one I really like. It's a dandelion. It's observed scientifically, mathematically, as being a fractal. You picture the head of a dandelion. If you were to take one of those spikes and separate it from the whole of the flower, what you would have is a stick with this fluffy array of branches at the top. It's self-similar to the whole. So I'll come back to the chat once we're done with this example of fractals in nature. So if you're having any questions or confusion about this, please still write that in the chat. But a dandelion, I think, is a neat idea of a fractal. And it's identified geometrically as being a fractal. So as we go through these, please consider, is this a exact self-similar fractal or a quasi-self-similar fractal? Are we dealing with exact or partial? Another common fractal, one they I think particularly like, is, I believe that's Romesco broccoli. And this is spoken about quite a lot when it comes to fractals. It's a neat fractal in nature. If you were to break this part down into its individual components, you would find at different scales it resembles the whole. So I can see the chat now. Is everyone okay with that? People are seeing the fractal. You can start breaking down that head of broccoli and the individual parts, even though they're different sizes, different scales, they're self-similar to the whole. This is a neat example of broccoli. I haven't got a picture, but I think many of us can imagine it in our minds of the normal broccoli we would imagine. And you know how you have that head of broccoli, and then you tear off a floret, and that floret resembles its own head of broccoli. So this one is more self-similar than a normal head of broccoli, which is why they prefer to use this example. But you would see a more partial fractal with a common head of broccoli, one that we're more familiar with. Does that make sense? They like this one because it's more exact. They see fractals on a large scale. So one that they speak about also is mountaintops. If you were to zoom out and see it from a distance, those mountaintops form a particular pattern, almost like a leaf or like tendrils. But then if you were to zoom in closer, you find that there's a lot of repeating patterns in how mountaintops are structured. And we'll come back to this in a moment, this particular concept. I want us just to get familiar, without being too complex, about how common fractals are observed in nature, mountaintops being a good example. You see these spikes, and depending on how bad you are at drawing, like myself, or how young you are, you draw these simple mountains that can look more like a cone. And that's not how mountains look, they're jagged. But if you start cutting that up and zooming in, you see that if you were standing on top of that mountain and just looking down at your feet, you would see the same type of pattern on a fractal level as you would see if you were to zoom out and look at the whole. Sister Barrelin says, so it then depends on how deep you look into the details. Yeah, yes, I would suggest yes. It can be at different scales. We'll look at seashells. Shells are a good example of fractal patterns. You could cut that all across here, and you would be left with what just looks like a smaller version of the whole shell. You could cut it here, and this inner part would just end up looking like a smaller version of the whole shell. It becomes this fractal at different scales. Where they're often seen and referred to is with snowflakes and ice crystals. They tend to form fractal patterns quite neatly. Snowflakes or any type of ice crystal. That's where fractals are particularly frequently observed. So I just want to look at one more fractal pattern, and this one is not found in nature. This was something that was constructed. So I'll give you a picture of it, and then we'll go back to our study. This is called the Mandelbrot set, and it was named after the man who constructed this. Fractals are a late study of mathematics and geometry. And one of the reasons that they were such a late study is because they became easier to understand, easier to construct once computers and technology came onto the scene. So this one was constructed in the 1970s. So if you just have that picture in your mind, I think you can see that if you were to zoom in, if you were to cut it, is my mouse visible? Okay. if you were to cut it here, hoping you can see that, it's where that big ball and that smaller ball meet. If you were to cut it there, this smaller one would be self-similar to the structure of the whole. So this small is self-similar to the whole. If you were to cut it here, then this smallest on the far left, that structure would be self-similar to this larger structure, self-similar to the whole. So is this fractal self-similar, exact, or quasi? Sister Sandra says quasi. Brother Wally says quasi. Why do you say quasi? Everyone's saying quasi. Everyone's on the ball this morning. I think you're seeing that there's this little, it's almost like a heart shape. Not equal in size. When it comes to exact self-similar fractals, they don't consider the size. It's the comparison of the parts, the geometry, mathematical geometry of the parts that makes it exact, without them having to be equal in size. It comes down to equations. So while they're not equal in size, what makes them quasi is the fact that this one has this indentation. But once you deal with that, and once you start zooming in, and once they do this on a computer, they can make this zoom in infinitely. It would never end. This little dot at the end of here would just become another structure. So once you get inside this fractal, it would become exact. But the whole of it, to form that fractal, is quasi. So this is quasi. Brother Russell says the bigger one is like a heart and the smaller ones are round. Yes. So this whole structure would become a quasi-fractal at the beginning. Once you start zooming in, these ones just become exact fractals of one another. So we'll end share. Back again. This study of fractals particularly came into its own in the 1970s. It was that Mandelbrot set. It's considered one of the greatest achievements or discoveries in mathematics. I don't know why, I'm just sharing that with you. But it's considered a big deal, what they were able to do in constructing that fractal based on mathematics. And it was Mandelbrot, Mr. Mandelbrot, who created that Mandelbrot set, and he is the one that, depending on how many scandals, because he wasn't very well liked, is kind of considered the father of this study of fractals. He associated that name fractal with this study, created that term around 1975, and in 1979 he presented that Mandelbrot set. So this was a 1975 to 1979 succession of studies in mathematics, but we see them all through nature. And one of the things that people struggle with is, how did these scientists, experts, miss this study for so long, because they're so prevalent in nature? But really once the 1970s came and you had IBM computers, it really gave them the ability to study these with much more detail. So all through nature you have these examples of repeating patterns and fractals. Would you say that most of these are exact or most of these are quasi? Brother Brendan says quasi. Sister Brody says quasi. I think you would be correct. When they're seen in nature, the vast majority I think we would call quasi-fractals. It's really once you start going into ones you would create with computers that you see a lot of exact fractals. To repeat the question, we looked through those photos of mountaintops, of ferns, of ice crystals, and the question is, those fractals that we see in nature, are they more likely to be quasi or only resembling in certain parts, or are they more likely to be exact when found in nature? That was for Brother Troy, if he wants to think about it. When you look at the mountaintops, Brother Troy says he believes it's quasi, and I agree with him. Most of the ones that we see in nature are not exact self-similar fractals. It's computers and mathematics that tend to create an exact self-similar fractal. So mostly we're dealing with this one when it comes to nature. Leaves, ice crystals, mountains, etc. So this study of fractals, it came into being in the late 1970s. 1979 you have Mr. Mandelbrot. I'm sure he has some very scientific titles. I did have his full name down. He's a Polish-born mathematician, Benoit Mandelbrot. I'm sure the French will find fault with my pronunciation. He's really headed that work through the 70s and the 80s and into the 90s as well. So it's quite relatively new. And it's only shortly after then that we start the study of reform lines. 1989, that is the time of the end. The increase of knowledge for this movement begins. And it's a study of reform lines. And what do we then understand? Those reform lines chiefly being beginning and end of ancient Israel, beginning and end of modern Israel. So we're given really four. We're given principally four reform lines, ones that we would, and I've suggested this is quite a quasi definition. I know you can't see me there. I can't see on this computer either. So we're just given a really basic reform line, but four of them in 1989. And we have, over the last 31 years, we've increased in our understanding of these reform lines. But for most of that time period, it was just one structure. And we have this represented with this Omega reform line in our own time, what we refer to as the line of the 144,000. And we get most of this reform line from Ellen White's writings themselves. At least this history, from what would line up with the Sunday law to the Second Advent. So we get at least 3/5 of that reform line given to us. And for most of the time period that this movement has been in existence, that's all it has been, just that one line. And along the way, there's been changes that have been made as we've wrestled with the construction of this line. You may be familiar, years ago, the structure used to look something like this. You would have the first, second, and third angel's message, and then you would have what they called the fourth, and it would be, they would call it like a mini repeat, where you would have like a first, fourth, They would talk about the fourth angel. And none of that really is fit for purpose. We don't look at that anymore. But part of the reason that people were constructing reform lines this way is they were wrestling with the details of how they are constructed. It didn't really fit into place. It began to fit into place in 2014 with the study of Ezra 7:9. And what that study, if I can summarise a more expansive study in history, perhaps oversimplify, is it started to show us that if this line, this top line, if you were to break it, you start seeing self-similar parts. So they may choose to break it at the Sunday law. This is the waymark of the Sunday law. If you break the reform line here, and this is going back to before it advanced to this stage, you're left with two parts, the church and the world. And what you start to see is you're given another reform line that's a part of the whole, a part of the one self, but now you have two out of that one self and they're self-similar. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to people? People are saying yes. So for most of the last 31 years, it's just been this one structure, the one self, the one entity, like Romesco head of broccoli. And then we saw that if you were to break it, you break something, you have two of them. So that breaking took time to be done correctly. It was a process. But even though it took some working out over years, it was recognized that you're left with these self-similar parts. So they soon began to be called fractals. And that was how they were termed in this movement, identified as fractals. Then in that time period, the last dispensation, 2014 to 2019, we became more exact about how these fractals were structured. And we saw over that last dispensation that you don't just have two, you actually have these three. You have three different subsets that can be broken off from the one self. And when you break them off from the one self and you line them up next to each other, you see that they're self-similar. So this line of the priests is self-similar to the line of the 144,000. You have ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. You have Sunday law, close of probation, second advent. But is that exact or quasi? We're talking about exact or quasi, self-similar fractals. This is one of the issues that we find starts to separate us from FFA even early on last year. People are saying quasi. I agree. When it comes to the Midnight Cry, it predicted 2019 was a shut door. Predicted that it's the close of probation. What does FFA immediately do with that? They say it's exact. So this close of probation, Michael stands up. They bring it down to here and say, Michael's going to stand up. Intercession ends for everyone associated with this reform line. So they're saying this waymark is an exact self-similar fractal of this waymark, close of probation, Daniel 12:1. And we started to say, hold on, this is the second advent. Do we expect Christ to come back and take the priests to heaven in 2021 at Panium? No. So without having terms like exact or quasi, what we began to recognize is that there's inconsistency with how the reform lines are being used. If this is going to be treated as an exact fractal, then this should be treated as an exact fractal. We must have consistency. If this is, we didn't use the word quasi, if this is quasi, second advent, then this is quasi, close of probation, which means that it is, if I can go back to that Webster's definition, it has likeness in the principal points, but it is not an exactness. It's not a perfect, exact likeness. So, this one is not exact. It has similarities. This is Jacob's time of trouble. The waymark of concord is the death decree. Without going into that too much, we've already gone through that waymark. Is this waymark an exact fractal of this waymark or a quasi? We'd all recognise that it's quasi because Brother Brendan says their argument breaks down immediately because of the second advent. I agree, and that's the point we were trying to make back to them. But their unwillingness to learn and be consistent went to such an extent that they refused to let go of their idea of the exact nature of the close of probation for the priests. And at least as of July, they still believed that that was an exact fractal. It's a breakdown in methodology. So we have been through the death decree for the priests. Have any of us experienced a death decree in our own countries? No, I think I can answer that one. I don't think anyone is going to say yes to that. We haven't been through an exact fractal experience of the death decree, but it has had similarities. The unity of people who oppose this movement, putting aside their differences and attacking, has taken place. There are so many similarities between what we would expect to see at the death decree and what we have experienced now. So many similarities. It's also been a waymark associated with death without trying to make a massive application. Through this waymark, we have experienced the death of George Floyd, the death of John Lewis, and the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's been a history of death. I just want to make that point. But it is not exact, self-similar to the death decree on the line of the 144,000. We are dealing with quasi-self-similar fractals.